I think we can start. When when I was looking at Bethel U for April, I thought, and for quite some time now, I thought it would be interesting for congregational members to be able to see and hear what our confirmation students are experiencing, or at least a small piece of it. And so I invited our confirmation teachers, and every one of them said yes, they were willing and able to be with us. So today we have Pastor Tim with us, and he is, of course, he teaches the 7th grade, and he teaches them the 22 Bible stories you don't want to miss. And basically, it's going back to those Bible stories that many of them may have heard a lot over the years, but looking at them from a different perspective, a perspective that they're able to work with right now as 7th graders. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Tim.
Welcome. Thank you for being here. Myrna, hello. Good to have you with us.
I had a lot of trouble getting in this morning, but I'm thankfully you sent the second link. And I know there are a couple others waiting. I'm going to text a couple here because we've been talking, none of us could get in.
Yeah, thank you, Myrna.
So the title of this lesson with 7th graders is Guilty. It's the 13th lesson out of 22. And one of the things I tell the 7th graders and their parents at the beginning of the year is that 7th grade is truly a transitional year. During the course of the year, the children will move from black and white thinking to a more nuanced form of thinking. Jean Piaget, the child development psychologist, talk about that age 12, 13, the time when human brains start looking at things more abstractly. He called it formal operations. And indeed, during the course of the year, I can see the kids one by one being able to think in a more nuanced fashion about texts. And this is one of those that gives an opportunity to do so. So I'm going to teach it just like I do with the kids, but in an abbreviated fashion because we started 15 minutes late. I want to begin, though, with the opening, look at our brokenness. Barb is going to put that up on the screen for you. And we're all going to move to a side slot. Good. I will read it, and then I'll ask the questions at the bottom and give you a chance to respond. Great Spirit, look at our brokenness. We know that in all creation, only the human family has strayed from the sacred way. We are the ones who are divided within ourselves and among ourselves. We are the ones who must come back to walk in the sacred way. Great Spirit, Sacred One, teach us love, compassion, and honor, that we may heal the earth and heal each other. And that is an Ojibwe prayer. Three questions for you to contemplate. What can you tell about the theology that undergirds this prayer? Is it like or unlike Christian theology? Could you pray this prayer? It would be helpful if everybody would unmute and we can just have a conversation. What is the theology? Is it like or unlike Christian theology? And could you, as a Christian, pray this prayer? Anyone want to reflect?
Well, go ahead, darling.
Okay. I could certainly pray this prayer. While I'm not used to referring to God as Great Spirit, if you would just change that word to "Oh God" or something like that, or Heavenly Father, nothing else would differ. You know, Great Spirit triggers the native picture for me, and especially because I'm doing some reading in it right now. But they appear to worship one God, at least, or one greater God. I'm not sure which, but I think the one God. And it fits with our brokenness, the way we see our, sinfulness. So I'm perfectly fine with it.
Well, thank you for sharing your reflections. Welcome, Kaylee. Welcome, Alice. If you could unmute, that would be great. Clark, you wanted to weigh in.
It reminds me very much of AA when they speak of a higher power. It may be a more general sense, but I think there is that sense that there is a power greater than ourselves, and I see that being spoken in the Ojibwe form. Again, it doesn't move into Christ or Holy Spirit necessarily, but that I think there is that sense of a power much greater than ourselves. So in that sense, I could pray that prayer.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on those three questions?
I like the third sentence in that. We are the ones who are divided within ourselves and among ourselves. I like the way that's worded. That shows me that this is a human problem. We're all humans, and we can't blame the environment. We can't blame everything else. This is our problem, and this is the way we were made.
Great, thank you, Myrna. One more, anybody? Unmute, please. All right, then we'll move on. We won't do the entire psalm that I have listed here, but I think it's worth noting the first three verses. Very familiar, used on Good Friday. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. That psalm, attributed to King David, I think reflects much of the theology that is part of the Ojibwe understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human, and that is that we sin. So I'm going to give you the biblical background. That's what's underneath the psalm. And I tell the kids that this is an R-rated Bible story. And I hope that doesn't offend them. And if they have any concerns, they can talk to me later. But we can't really enter into 2 Samuel 12 unless we understand 2 Samuel 11. And I will summarize that chapter briefly for you. It begins in the spring of the year. Kings go out to make war. And David was very good at making war. At the height of his power, both the north and the south, Israel and Judah, were united. They were the bad boys on the block. They would decide which city-state do we want to capture, and then we would enslave those people, take over their property, and life is grand. God is giving us all these victories. But David was getting old, and he probably didn't feel physically up to the challenge of waging war, and he may have lost the heart for it. So he put his general Joab in charge, and they were fighting against the Ammonites, a city-state. And David was back at home, and because it was a hot day, he was on his rooftop, no air conditioning at that time. When it was really hot, people went to their rooftops, and they went to their rooftops for eating, for leisure, and for bathing. David, being king, had the tallest house in town. And so he's on his flat roofed house and he's looking around at all that he is in charge of, and he notices a woman bathing. And the woman is very beautiful. He sends servants to inquire. Her name is Bathsheba. She is married to Uriah the Hittite, who is a soldier fighting for David under the command of General Joab. And David sends his servants to her and he calls her to himself. And the text is very clear. he lay with her, he had sex with her, and then he sent her away. I guess because if you're the king, you can do that kind of thing. Meanwhile, Joab was at the front. Uriah the Hittite, his servant, married to Bathsheba, was still fighting. And time passed. And after a month, Bathsheba sent word to David saying, I'm pregnant. Now, Joab has Uriah the Hittite with him. There's no way Uriah could have impregnated her. David is very smart. He sends a letter to Joab at the front, and he says, send your servant Uriah the Hittite to me. So Uriah the Hittite, welcome to all of those who are coming on board. Uriah the Hittite comes back home. David thanks him for his service, gets a briefing on how the conquest of the Ammonite city is going. And then he says, all right, well, you deserve some R&R. You go home, put your feet up, enjoy your family, and come back tomorrow and I'll give you a message. When David gets up the next morning and he goes out on his front steps to get the newspaper, Uriah the Hittite is there. He has slept on the steps. He has not gone home. David says, why didn't you go home? And Uriah the Hittite says, you know, my lord, Joab, the commander, he's sleeping out under the stars in a tent. So are all my fellow soldiers. I couldn't go home and lay with my wife while they're doing such and so. So David says, okay, come to a banquet tonight. I want you to be part of it. So at the banquet, David almost pours copious amounts of wine into Uriah the Hittite. And when the banquet is over, he said, all right, you go home. And tomorrow come and I will give you a message to send to Joab. So he gets up the next morning looking to get the paper, and there is Uriah the Hittite. He did not go home. He did not lay with his wife. He did not impregnate her. So David sent a message to Joab, and the message was very simple. He said, in the heat of the battle, position Uriah the Hittite in such a place that he will be killed. And that happened. Uriah was next to the wall. They were trying to siege the city. People would pour down boiling oil, had bows and arrows. They would shoot arrows. They would throw spears, rocks, anything they could. And Uriah the Hittite died. So Joab sent a message to David, and he talked about a very bad day on the battlefield. Lost lots of people. David was incensed. That would never have happened if he were there and commanding. And then he read down a little further and it said, and your servant Uriah the Hittite has died as well. And David said, okay, well, these things happen. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Those who live by the sword, die by the sword. We'll move on. Well, Bathsheba went into a period of mourning because she has lost her husband. She buried him. And then after she was done with her period of mourning, David called for her, took her into his house, made her one of his wives. He had many. He also had many concubines. And she eventually gave birth to a boy child. Which leads us to our story today, which Barb has on the text. Mark, would you please read verses 1, 2, and 3 for us?
And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children, and it used to eat of his meager fare and drink of his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him.
So there you go. This poor man has a lamb that is like a daughter to him. And David is hearing the story from Nathan, the prophet. Myrna, would you please read verse 4?
Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take care of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him.
He certainly could have taken one out of his own flock. He had many, but he decided to take the poor man's lamb that was like a daughter to him. Look at verse 5 and 6. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against that man, because David was a just man. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." And verse 7, Nathan said to David, "You are the man. You are the man who did not sacrifice one of your own ewe lambs. You are the man who took one from the flock of a poor man, a man like Uriah the Hittite." Lisa, would you read the rest of verse 7 and 8 and 9, please?
Okay. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and have taken his wife to be your wife and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites.
Thank you, Lisa. If you look down at small group work, open, this is part of every lesson. It's called an anticipatory set by teachers. It just tries to get the kids thinking in the same direction that the leader of the class is trying to go in. It reads, "Have you ever been caught red-handed doing something wrong?" And the kids spend about 3 to 5 minutes discussing that. Did you try to lie or scheme your way out of it? Or did you admit your guilt and accept your punishment? We won't take the time to do that now, but when I simply ask the question, have you ever been caught red-handed doing something wrong? I think most of us probably had something flash in our brains. We remembered. It might have been years ago. We might have been children or adolescents, but it came to mind. All of us do this. David did this. Verses 10 and through 12. Kaylee, would you read those verses, please?
Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah and Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbors, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David.
That's good. Thank you, Kaylee. If we had time, and I do this with the kids, we would look ahead further in 1 Samuel, and we see that the prophecy was perfectly fulfilled. These things that he prophesied did happen. Now we get David's reaction. Darlene, would you please read 13 and 14?
David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die.
Thank you to Darlene and everyone who read. Barb, if you could go back up to the psalm, please. No doubt you have prayed this psalm repeatedly, but you never may have made the connection between what David just said, which was, I have sinned against the Lord, and verses 1 through 3 attributed to David. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. He knew because Nathan pointed it out. Well, if you scroll down, Barb, you'll notice that there is a section called Dig. We're not going to take time to do any of these questions. It's just pulling out things from the text. And now you go down to Reflect. And I want you to look at number 2. Do you have a Nathan in your life? If so, how in the past has she or he guided you and helped you? If not, would it be a good thing to have someone like Nathan to correct you when you sin? Do any of you have a quote, Nathan, unquote, in your life? A confessor, a friend, a pastor, a sister, a brother? And if so, will you tell us about that?
I'll go.
Great, thank you.
I think I've had a variety of Nathans in my life at different times, depending on what was going on, where I was, where I lived, and all of that. My sister knows, in the words of the Bible, my sister knows all of my sins. She knows all the ways that I have screwed up in my life at different times. And I don't think she was as bald in her pointing out like Nathan was ever, but I trust her to tell me the truth. And I think it's really important that we have people who tell us the truth. I think Tim is really good about that, although I get more defensive with him than I do with my sister, and I have no idea why. The question right up above this one is, how do you react? And I get defensive. I want to cry. There are a lot of reactions there. But, you know, luckily the Nathans in my life meet me with a lot of grace, and I'm really grateful for that.
Lisa, did your sister Mary volunteer and take this role on by your own initiative, or did you invite her to play that role?
Ginger, sorry about the dog. I would say, I don't know. We've always been that for each other.
Okay, good. We'll look at number 4 under Reflect. In order to hear the Nathans in my life, they need A, to talk in stories. B, they need to be gentle. C, I need to be less defensive. Or D, I have to be open to instruction. Anyone want to reflect on those 4 options? Barb?
I think B, C, and D are all things that I relate to. They don't need to talk in stories to me. They can be pretty straightforward. But I do need them to be, I need to be less defensive. I do need them to be gentle and catch me at a time when I'm open to hearing what they have to say. And they need to be somebody that is really close to me and that I trust.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on number 4? Yes, Myrna.
I have several friends who, depending on the situation, would be my Nathans. And some of them are better at giving me support. Others are very straightforward with their thoughts. And for some reason, because I've known them a long time, I'm very fine with that. I don't feel, when they say something, I listen. And I guess, I think we kind of, like I said, these are friends for 50 years probably
Wow.
or more. And so we don't have to have any fences put up between us. I mean, we're past that. And so I think, depending on the situation, I am more open to some than others, but for the most part, they're my rock. They're the ones that seem to know when I need support, when I need to be talked to.
Mhm. Excellent. Some of you may know the name Pastor Chuck Swindoll, famous pastor from Dallas, Texas, I believe he's from Dallas. And in one of his books, he talked about the fact that he belongs to an accountability group, fellow pastors, and they review each week their week and perhaps any mishaps they have had in keeping the walk with Jesus. And he writes that it's so important that we have at least one person in our lives who can tell us the truth. And then if we can hear the truth and actually respond to it, we are doubly blessed. Well, Barb, if you would scroll down to the final section, closing thought. I will read this to you. This is a section where the seventh graders who have passed into formal operations understand clearly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer is saying. Those who are still in black and white operations, they have trouble with this text, and you can see it. It's like ping, ping, ping. The kids who have moved to a higher stage of moral reasoning stand out. But here is the text from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I will read it to you. You can read along. The pious fellowship permits no one to be a sinner. Have you ever been in a congregation where some couple divorces and then one or both of them stop attending? Now, it may be that they just assume that they wouldn't be accepted because they divorced. And if you go back 30 or 40 years, you'll feel that more strongly. Or it may be that somebody in the congregation or many in the congregation are somehow broadcasting that if you fall into divorce, you are no longer welcome here. Or think back to your high school days. Maybe in your youth group, there was a boy and a girl who got pregnant. And immediately, the boy and the girl stopped attending. Maybe it was them just thinking they wouldn't be accepted because of their, quote, sin, unquote. Or maybe somebody in the congregation told them that they were no longer worthy. Had we the time, I think you could think of several examples. Continuing with Bonhoeffer. So everybody must conceal, and I apologize, his language is very masculine and not gender broad. So everyone must conceal his sin from himself and from the fellowship. We dare not be sinners. Some of you will know the name or maybe read the books of Pastor Nadia Bolz-Weber, founding pastor at Church of Saints and Sinners, Church of All Saints and Sinners in Denver, Colorado. And one of the things by that title they are putting out is that we have sinners here. Second paragraph. Many Christians are unthinkingly horrified when a real sinner is discovered among the righteous. So we remain alone with our sin, living in lies and hypocrisy. Those who hide a behavior or a habit in the fellowship, lest others in the fellowship be shocked, to recognize that they are doing this or that or the other, which is considered to be suspect and not necessarily accepted within their congregation. Maybe you can think of someone, maybe you can think of yourself as someone who has to remain alone with your sin, living in lies and hypocrisy. David, fortunately, did not have to do that because Nathan pointed it out. The psalm is very clear. I know my sin. But many Christian fellowships, according to Bonhoeffer, are filled with people who hide their sin because it wouldn't be accepted. Third paragraph. It is the grace of the gospel which is so hard for the pious to understand. It confronts us with the truth that says, you are a sinner, a great, desperate sinner. Now come as the sinner that you are to the God who loves you. That's radical. Nadia Bolz-Weber and her fellow founding members named their church All Saints and Sinners Lutheran Church. Imagine a church starting now, and the name chosen is All Sinners Lutheran Church. If you relocated and needed to find a new congregation, and if you saw a church with a sign out front that said All Sinners Lutheran Church, would you be inclined to attend, visit, even give it a thought? If they so blatantly just came out and said, we are all sinners. Again, Bonhoeffer, you are a sinner, a great, desperate sinner. Now come as the sinner that you are to the God who loves you. He wants to be gracious to you. You do not have to go on lying to yourself and your brothers as if you were without sin. You can dare to be a sinner. Thank God for that. All saints and sinners, sinners and saints is a common expression used among Lutherans. It is a mistranslation of what Luther called simul justus et peccator. Simul means at the same time, justus means justified, peccator means sinner. What Luther wrote was simultaneously justified and sinful. The gospel recognizes our sin, but imputes to us the righteousness of Christ. The gospel recognizes our sin, but imputes to us the righteousness of Christ. So we are simultaneously righteous and sinner. That's the backbone of the Lutheran Church, theologically. And yet, in how many Lutheran churches have we had a couple going through divorce that felt they must leave and join a different congregation? Or had teenagers who were found to be pregnant who felt no longer welcome? Or had someone accused and convicted of a public crime? It was in the newspapers. And then feel, I can no longer go to my church. I have to find a new place where I can pretend I'm not a sinner. Some people wonder, what do we as Lutherans have to offer? I just read an article from Bishop Hassanelli, and she asked that very question. I think the text that we looked at today would say, Darlene, thank you for joining us today. Darlene, you are a sinner, a great, desperate sinner. Now come, as the sinner that you are to the God who loves you? What would it take, and this is a question for you now, we'll close with this. What would it take in your own personal theology to attend a church like that? To feel welcome in a church that welcomes you? Groucho Marx once said, I would never belong to a club that would accept someone like me. What if you found a church that would accept someone like you? How would that feel? And what would that call out from you now that you have become part of this sinner fellowship? Any thoughts before we close?
I would be very ready to jump into that church.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Darlene. Others?
I think it's sad that many times when people do have really serious challenges in their lives is when we lose them because they feel that they can't share those.
I can think of many, Barb.
Mm-hmm.
Even over my tenure at Bethel, I can think of many.
So the challenge to all of us is to be careful not to feel that we are judging anybody else, that we are accepting them as they are.
Uh-huh. Hello, Lois. Thanks for joining us.
I just found the correct link for today. I sat with the old one there for a long time, and I thought, I guess I'll just go back and see if there's anything else on email. Well, there it was. So I'm sorry I missed the rest. Sorry, I missed the rest of the class.
Well, we are too. Well, let's imagine that you make a poor decision. You're at a party, you're offered a drink, you take it. You're offered a second drink, you take it. And then maybe you have one or two more. And then the party ends and you have this talk with yourself. Am I okay to drive? Well, it's only a couple miles. And then you choose to get into your car and drive home. And a police car pulls you over. A breathalyzer is offered. You accept it. And then the next time the Northfield News is published in the arrest record of the police report, there is your name. A DUI. Maybe there's underlying alcoholism, maybe not, but you got caught. Nathan the prophet, in the person of a sheriff's deputy, has called you out. Would you hesitate to go to church the next Sunday? If your congregation understands, like Bonhoeffer did, that we are all sinners, great, desperate sinners, but still invited as the sinner that you are to the God who loves you, then perhaps not. And that is what I think all Christian congregations have the opportunity to live and to be and to share. Hopefully ours as well. Thank you for being part of today's class. I know some of you need to move to the worship that is taking place in just a few minutes. I saw Madeline walk in while we were looking at the text. She's going to be the tech person for that. If you wanted to join the 1045 worship, you may. To honor that, I have cut the class off short. We obviously looked at it piecemeal because of the time considerations, having started late. But I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank Barb for the opportunity to share what I do with seventh graders on a weekly basis with you today. So with that, I turn it back to Barb.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. We really greatly appreciate your time with this, but all the time that you've spent with our seventh graders throughout the years. They have been exposed to some really great learning. Thank you to you.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Where do we find the link to the live service that's going to be occurring? On the Bethel U?
So take a look in the email that brought you the taped version of the worship service, and the Zoom worship link is there, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it's correct. And if it's not, Lois, call me.
Well, I would like to take a look at what the live service is like.
Good.
It's actually not a live service. It's a live audience for a taped service.
Oh, okay. Okay, so it's still a taped service. Okay.
Yep, it's the link that goes out called Fireside Worship, but with a live group observing it.
Okay, well, Noel and I were the live group on the one that we first watched this morning, so we were very alive, believe me.
Oh, good.
Pastor Tim?
Yes.
I guess a question that I have, and maybe another time you can answer this because there isn't time now, is how does the church then balance that message of forgiveness with also the message that Nathan brought to David?
You know, if we had had time in looking at the reflect questions that is addressed directly,
Okay.
and what I tell the kids is that sin has consequences. We can be forgiven, we are forgiven, but sin has consequences. And so the consequence was that the child, the boy child born of Bathsheba and David, died. And that is really hard for some of the kids to understand and to accept. For others, they are able to articulate something to the effect, all sins have consequences. And we have to stand with them, even as we know that our God and hopefully our church forgives us for what we've done.
Thanks, honey.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Barb.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye-bye.